Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name's Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs and try to do those things more responsibly. Today, I've got a conversation for you with my friend Grace. I was originally going to post a monologue video today, but my conversation with Grace was so much fun and I think such a great setup for the things that I want to continue exploring that I decided to release it now instead of holding on to it. I met Grace actually through doing the podcast. She watches my videos and reached out to me, and we had some private conversations because she just wanted to talk through some of the things that she was going through and some of the things that I was talking about, and we struck up a friendship. So I asked her if she wanted to have a conversation for the podcast. So I'm so excited that she was willing to do that, and I thought it was really enjoyable. So I hope you get something out of our conversation. Well, Grace, thank you so much for being on the channel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk with you. Before I get too deep into it, why don't you just give a little introduction? Who are you for people who don't know who you are?
Yeah, so I'm Grace. I'm a student at UT Austin, and I'm really interested in questions about meaning, philosophy, and I've been thinking about these for a large part of my short life, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's something I'm really interested in.
So what got you kind of interested in the big questions? I know we've talked about privately about that a little bit, but like where did that start, where you started having those questions of like that needed to be answered?
Yeah, I'm not really sure where it started. I think I've always just been a very curious and questioning person as a child. I was like looking back at my journal entries, and then I saw that I had my first like existential crisis when I was 12. And I was like, oh no.
You're ahead of the curve.
Unfortunately, but or maybe, but I got into like, I was very, I'm like 2002, so I grew up with the internet, and so from a very young age, I was like on Tumblr, on social media. And so I started off being very involved in like Tumblr and fandoms, but later on, I kind of had like a very big dive into like right-wing things. And then from there, I like kind of took a step back and I got into like Jordan Peterson. And I don't know, a lot of things happened at the same time, but from Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Peugeot, Paul Vanderklay, and a little bit of John Vervaeke, but we're still moving around.
Yeah, well, there's so much to consume and so little time, but yeah, well, it's great to be talking with you. So you wanted to talk to me about some of the videos that I've been making about ultimate truth and personal truth, and you had mentioned Kierkegaard a little bit too. So why don't you give a little background on why you wanted to talk, and then we'll just jump in from there.
Yeah, so I found the Kierkegaard course that I took last year. I was in the middle of one of my existential crises, but I was struggling with questions of, is the Bible true? And like, is Christianity true? Right. And I was hearing all these opposing viewpoints, and I just wanted to know like, what is objectively true? And so I was having these questions, and I found this course that was about Kierkegaard, irony, and aporia and paradox, but a bunch of things. And so in the course, it basically talked about a lot of Kierkegaard's philosophy. And so one of the interesting things he talks about is, he talks about personal truth and objective. And so a little context to his work is he was at the time of the Romantic movement in Germany. And so during this time, there was a lot of people who were deconstructing and then promoting sensuality in the place of deconstruction, and like being in favor of the senses and all of that. And he saw that, and he felt like that was going in the wrong direction. He believed that it should just be left at the deconstruction, and it should be left for the individual to kind of construct, not necessarily construct, but truthfully find their way to a personal truth. And something he talks about is like, rather than personal versus subjective, like a personal view of personal versus objective. He says like a personal view of the objective. So a personal truth, that's a version of the objective.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like a quick rundown, but he was a very big fan of Socrates, and what Socrates did was he asked like a lot of questions and left people at a state of aporia, which is like not knowing what to say, not having an answer. And he believed that there was no need to go from there and construct some kind of overall philosophy. He believed like you should just leave the individual in that state and let them kind of forge their way themselves. I think,
yeah,
if I'm describing it accurately,
it's hard to really know. Honestly, that's so interesting. I need to read more Kierkegaard. I know I've been trying to for a long time, but it's sort of been on the back burner. But yeah, that's so interesting. I have I bought a book like I think 2 years ago of his essays, of like his religious essays or something, and it was the way that it was translated. It was supposed to be sort of an easier read, sort of more colloquial, so it wasn't so dense. But like I read a bit of it, and it's just sort of been sitting, you know, you have that pile of books and you're like picking and choosing which one. So I've read some of them, but I haven't done that. But yeah, that all sounds interesting, and it definitely sounds similar to sort of the way that I'm trying to like unpack this, and the way that I'm like sort of see how we're identifying with the things that we find true, and the way that we're you know, coming to those things. Before we get too big into the ideas, just so everybody sort of kind of knows where you're coming from, you're saying you're trying to understand more about Christianity, but you grew up sort of in an atheistic framework. Is that correct?
Yeah. Completely without any religion. So it's all very different to me.
Yeah. And so what was the pull to try to understand the objective claims that were being made by people who were supporting Christianity? Did it come from Peterson, or was there something before that that led you there?
I think it actually came from C.S. Lewis. So in a philosophy class that I was taking my senior year, we read, Screwtape Letters. And before that, I had very much, looked down on Christianity a lot.
That's okay. A lot of people do.
But I didn't really see the point of it. And also I hadn't really, I had never like really been exposed to it. And so after that, I kind of delved into the Protestant evangelical side of YouTube, where a lot of the focus, one of the channels I watched, I don't know if you've heard of Paul and Morgan. They do a lot of like Christian dating and like thing I found after that. And it was just a lot of like, we didn't kiss until marriage. And so I was like looking into that, and I also got into like a little new agey things, which is interesting. I was just looking for, I guess, an objective truth to the universe, I think. And so like I found New Age, and then I found that people who were like New Age is satanic, and that was also another side of the evangelical community. And those people were saying like, hell unless you're born again. And so then I became stressed about that. And so, yeah, that was kind of the path I went, trying to look for an objective truth. And I think that's like the state I was in when I found the articles.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and I shouldn't scoff at any of those things, but I see some of these like dating channels, and they're like, you know, like the couples who like, what's it like to be a good Christian couple, and they drive me nuts. But that's a whole nother topic. But yeah, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of people, you know, just because of how much is available on YouTube and how much people just will put out their perspectives without so much of a filter, it's easy to turn there to kind of try to unpack some of these things and, you know, get your degree in YouTube University to try to find that objective thing. And I definitely went down that hole too. And I mean, I came from the opposite way, where I'm like, I grew up really evangelical. And so then it started with atheism, and, you know, you go to the Richard Dawkins, the Sam Harris, the Christopher Hitchens, and you're watching the debates, and I stumbled into sort of the apologetics, where it was like, I already know the other side of that, the fluffy sort of evangelical side of Christianity, and that often gets put onto YouTube pages and branded into like families. So yeah, like I stumbled into this other world. So it's just so interesting to listen to, people's journeys.
It's so easy to get sucked in. I feel like there's just so much out there, and it's so easy to consume it. So
I know, and you get in these YouTube spirals, and all of a sudden, like, how am I here? Like, where did I go? You don't know where you took a turn, but all of a sudden, you're watching like, Full House clips or something. You're like, how did I get here? So what is it about? Do you think C.S. Lewis was that first trigger for you? Because I've heard a lot of people, and I love C.S. Lewis, and there's something about him that the way that he talks about Christianity is so compelling. But like, what was it for you that sort of lit that spark that was like, okay, I'm going to take this a little more seriously?
I almost can't remember, but there are some quotes that stick out to me. I think it was just a different worldview. And like, I remember there's a quote, I don't know if it's an extremely important one, but it was the devil, I think, talking about one of the people in hell who said, I haven't done anything I should have done, and I haven't done the things that like were required of me, or like I didn't do the things that were like the basic things I should have done, and I shouldn't have done like the step forward above that. Right. And I don't know, I think that stuck out to me because I guess I had like similar feelings in my own life that I don't know, I wasn't doing that. I also didn't know what I was doing because it was also like college application season, and that was a whole mess. But
the perfect time for an existential crisis.
Yeah, there are a lot of those. I don't know, and I think it was just a different perspective of Christianity and a different perspective of the world that made me want to look into it more and kind of like give it a try. And I think I kind of saw that in my own life, like the conversations that the devil was having to the demon, like what they were, like how they were trying to get that person to go to their side. Like I felt like I had their own life, and I don't know, it was like seeing that.
Yeah.
On page.
Yeah, no, C.S. Lewis does have this interesting way of like turning things on your head and having you see spirituality in this different light. And oftentimes he's not attacking it straight from like, oh, Christianity from the start. He kind of walks you through, gets you into this story. And I find him incredibly compelling too. But yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so let's move our way back to Kierkegaard. How has the study of Kierkegaard and the way that he looks at these things helped you in this journey of like trying to find objective truth?
I think I think the direction of taking a personal look at it took some of the stress off of me of trying to like constantly looking for that objective truth. And yeah, I think wait, could you repeat the question again?
Yeah. So how is that sort of, because you were saying you had this sort of need and this like drive in you, and it's almost an anxiety of like, oh, I gotta find what's objectively true. And so how has your interaction with Kierkegaard either helped that or, changed the way that you're looking at those things? How has that interaction helped you in this search of like trying to find, what I refer to as ultimate truth, Yeah,
I think going back to like the personal thing, that's definitely a big part. And also he talks about like one of the things he mentions is that how, I think it was ironically, but also a little bit of truth there, that he wants Christianity he wants it to be more difficult to be a Christian. And by that, he means he doesn't want it to be so easy to like just read the rules and just do them. He wants it to be, he would like it to be a process where the person is has to do some of the work themselves and find their own truth, their own version of what Christianity is. And I think that's something that I've tried to look for in objective truth, is applying it to my own life. Yeah, but I think on some, like, I still definitely question things and have occasional crises, but yeah, I think something about his is that, like, I don't know, I think I'm still not completely satisfied by personal truth, because I don't know, I feel like there are still contradictions with that when two people personally believe a thing. Like, an example, I guess, is Japan is very much a collective culture, and it works for them because of the society they're in, and how it has, like, what I heard is that they have a lot of natural disasters, and having a more collective culture where people have to agree and kind of submit to the group helps them to cooperate and get through these disasters, while in America, it's almost like completely individualistic. And I think that's like two personal truths, but I feel like there's a contradiction there somewhere, but I guess you could say that it works for each side. I don't know.
There's a lot of trade-offs, right? So, and there's positive and negatives that come from all of those things. And I think a lot of the contradictions come in where, you have certain people talking about things that may be subjective in the subjective manner, where it's like collective societies, individual societies, which one's better? Maybe there's an objective answer. Maybe that's something that's subjective in itself. And I think it's just such a tricky balance, because in one hand, there's this idea that we all have these personal truths, these things that we've personally collected through our experiences and that we believe deeply. And some of those things are okay to have those be different from somebody else's personal truth. But then there's this sort of clash where it's like there are certain things we're talking about in the reality of the world that become really difficult to kind of parse apart and figure out, well, how do we get to, finding the objective or ultimate truth that's outside of just my personal belief? Because I think there's this game where it's like you're either on either end of the spectrum, where it's like it's all personally curated, it's subjective, it's personal truth, and we shouldn't care to work with others to change that. Just live and let live. And then there's the other side where it's like, no, facts don't care about your feelings. This is how it is, blah, blah, blah. And it's like you get too far on either side and it becomes a real problem in trying to like really interact in the way that we're living in the world. And it's like, there has to be some medium, right? Because I think there's some things that are like, if it's personally true for me, that's fine. And it's okay that it's not personally true for somebody else. But how much of those things in the world are like that?
And like something I think about with that is like destructive behaviors. Like if something I personally believe is destructive and I see someone else doing that, but they personally don't think it's destructive, should I like step in and tell them to not do it? Like, I don't know my responsibility. And so I think that's a case of personal truths conflicting.
Well, that gets really tricky when it becomes to like lifestyle or moral beliefs. There's this sort of weird middle ground where there's part of culture that acts as if morality is subjective, and like, especially in America. So like in this individualistic culture, it becomes, well, you're going to do what you're going to do and I'm going to do what I'm going to do. You live how you see fit and I'll live how I see fit. But then there's still sort of this judgment of like, oh, you believe that, well, you're immoral. And it's like, and then there's this sort of like forced adoption of like, we want everybody to look at the world and the moral compass and the black and whites that we see, yet we're not willing to really look at the other side and sort of question those things as well. And how are we coming to those answers on like what's morally true, what's not? We've lost that process of how to do that, why to do that, if we should do that.
Mm-hmm.
But like you're talking about these collective cultures, I think that sort of scenario would play out very differently, because there's a lot of like communal guilt that can sometimes go into those things, where it's like, if I do something wrong, I'm bringing shame to my whole community and my whole family, and it becomes more of like, we are all in it together to do the right thing. And so
Yeah.
it's just a different way to look at it too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like that reminds me, like in this book I'm reading, that's kind of about Japan, they talk about shame a lot, and how in Japan shame is a really big part of the culture, and it's almost like conscience isn't as big as shame is, and so more people will do things to prevent shame from falling upon themselves and their family, rather than like for a conscience reason. And that's so different from America, but
Right.
yeah.
Well, and it's in some ways sort of this like cousin of conscience, where it's like, I don't do this because I don't want to feel the shame that comes with the behaviors. And so there's something to it that's like, well, it's kind of like a conscience, but it's like a group conscience that's reinforced by some social conditioning. And I think a lot of people, especially Americans and Western people, would say, oh, well, that's immoral. And that's just, shaming people into, not living their own truth. And that, I guess that's a distinct possibility, but there's also a certain level of accountability that comes in. And if you do have a right set of, like, ways of living that actually are going to be beneficial for the people, like it could be a really helpful thing.
Yeah.
But I guess it kind of depends on the spirit you're doing it too. It's also complicated.
Yeah, I was gonna mention, like, I feel like a lot of the conscience in like individual societies, I feel like that with judgment as well, like judgment against people who do things differently. I think it's really hard, self included, like to hold moral opinions, moral judgments, and seeing people act differently and not slightly look down on them, just a little bit. But it's like, it's something that I like notice every time I see someone behaving in a different moral way. I just, even if it's a small thing, like, I don't know, it's still like drinking alcohol. I don't know. When I when I see like people drink, I understand like the choice, but at least personally, it's a little bit
There's a
out of my
clashing.
comfort zone. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
I mean, and that's, I think, fair enough, especially depending on what you've seen in your life and the patterns that you've seen with the out of control nature of, alcohol consumption. Like myself personally, I've seen a lot of family members who fall into alcoholism or drug addiction, and it's just a path that's like, I don't even want to mess with that. And I drink. It's not that I drink, but I've never been drunk, and I don't plan to. And I don't mind if other people do, but like I personally think that it's probably not a good behavior to get into. And then it becomes that place where it's like, well, is there a moral obligation if I think there's objectively a pattern? And I think it all has to do with a lot of relationships, and it really depends on what someone claims to believe too. At least the way that I see when it comes to morality, there are a lot of things where we have moral judgments, and for a lot of secular people, those do seem to be either more social, like social conditioning, or what's popular within the time, or even just curated based on your own life experiences. For religious people, there tends to be more of a standard. A lot of religions have a certain set of books or set of like ideals that they hold to and believe to be morally true or not. And there it becomes a little more easy to kind of hold people's feet to the fire, I suppose, on their moral choices.
Yeah. I would agree with that, because when I was kind of in my politics, not really a politics phase, but just internet browsing, I felt like it was so easy for me to be swayed from one side to another, just based on like the most recent content that I was consuming. Like I noticed that when I was consuming more left-wing content, I felt more inclined to be on that side, and then vice versa.
Yeah.
So I would agree that I think religion and these very traditional institutions provide that kind of grounding that keeps you stable.
Yeah. Well, you said something really interesting that I think is definitely a phenomenon that we're seeing just with the 24-hour news cycle media consumption culture that we have, that I think there are a lot of people that get their morals and get their perceptions on what's right and wrong from the things that they consume. And you can easily get caught up in the things that we're watching reinforce these beliefs and these ideas and the spirits in which we're operating in conversations and in the world. And then that slowly becomes a moral compass without us totally even understanding exactly where we got these ideas and how they're coming from, and how to weigh all of them. And I wouldn't say that's wholesale a bad thing, but it's something to very much be cautious with. Like we can't help those things. And like I found myself, especially in certain cycles where I'd be watching certain things and having to just stop, because like I don't like the attitude that I'm getting from this. Even if I believe that the content and the things that they're saying is right, I don't like the way that it's manifesting in my life. And I need to take a break and a step back and really disconnect from the media to get a better sense of how to operate in the world better. And yeah, I mean, I think it's such a difficult question, especially when you don't have the answers of like, what is behind the universe, what is the thing that I think is underneath and that I should be putting at the top of the hierarchy and centering my life around. Like that's really hard to figure out, first of all. But like when you're still not ready to commit to anything, it's really hard to then act in the world in a way that you feel confident with or that makes sense, and you feel like you go into these existential crises.
Yeah, with like that's another thing, at least lately, I've been thinking about with Kierkegaard is he talks about like he advocates for using irony to kind of deconstruct and then building up from that to make your own personal truth. And so at least in my own life, I've questioned like, oh, it's very loud.
That's okay.
I've questioned like how far deconstructing is enough. Like how far is it until you can start building up again? And I don't know, that's something that I've questioned with like around.
Yeah, it's such a hard question. And I feel like I don't think I'm an outlier necessarily in like a Christian framework, but I'm definitely sort of on this new edge of sort of, I don't think that deconstruction is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think in some ways it can lead people to better belief and better construction of personal truth. But I firmly believe just because we personally believe something is true doesn't make that ultimately true or objectively true. And you got to walk this balance of like understanding that you're never going to have this full sense of like what is ultimately true and all figured out. Like you're just not going to do that as an individual. But how do we get better at trying to do those things? And I think deconstruction can sometimes be a good thing to help you get closer to that. I also think that at times it can be destructive. And the best thing to do instead of just deconstructing is to let the dust settle, stop pulling things apart, just sit and be able to say, I don't know, and take a breath and then figure out, okay, well, how do I make sense of these pieces? And I think in Western societies, because we're so individualistic, there's so many people trying to do it on their own. And I think that itself is a problem. I think we work best in community, whether that's within like a religious system or not. Like we work better when we're working with other people and we get clearer ideas and we can get outside of our own sort of minimal scope, and people can see things that we haven't been able to see. And what I fear about some of this deconstruction and this religious exploration is, one, not being willing to do it within a community, just doubling down on what you personally believe and just going with that and say, that feels right, so I'm going to do it. And then, not being cautious enough to say, well, maybe there is some ultimate truth out there. And maybe I don't know as much as I think I know. And like, maybe it's okay to say, I don't know, or I believe this, but, I'm still trying to figure out if it's right. And it- ah, I think there does need to be spaces where that becomes um, part of the conversation, like part of the dialogue. And it's really hard to find within church walls and outside of them. It just it's just not bred in our culture right now.
Yeah, I think something that's, I guess, kept me down is what you mentioned, the lack of community. Like that's definitely something that I haven't had a lot of in my life, especially with these kinds of questions. So yeah, I think I do see individualism as like a really big part of the culture, and especially on social media too. It feels like you can find out everything on the internet. And I think that's something that I've felt sometimes is that, oh, it's all at my fingertips. There's no need to, actually talk to people in real life. But there's definitely something that lacks in that kind of outlook.
Right.
So,
Well, and that is the feeling, right? Like it's all at my fingertips. If I just look hard enough, if I search long enough, I can find it. I can make it all come together. But I think what you see is that there's some diminishing returns with some of those things. There's nothing wrong with seeking information, trying to understand and make sense of the world. But I think you have to start questioning, well, why am I doing these things? Is there some control mechanism going underneath it? Am I doing it an act of fear? And why do I feel like I have to do this all on my own? We're limited beings. We're processing information, but we're wired in different ways. And there's so many people who think so differently than us. And I think it's really hard work to sit and try to understand someone who thinks very differently or speaks very differently than you. But if you can take the time and sort of learn those things, you can often learn a lot more than, spending time in what you might call an echo chamber, having people repeating the same ideas over and over. But I mean, it's interesting. I think there's a place for all of those things. There's a place for going and searching on your own and looking through those things. And then there's a time to stop and say, hey, I need to disconnect and like just process through these things and not consume anything. And there's times to work that out with other people in dialogue, back and forth, sort of battling with ideas. And then there's times to just listen and take that in and not try to make an argument for something. And then I think there are even times where it's like silence, like just go go take a walk, leave your phone, be silent, let your brain process. And that I think is the biggest thing we're missing. If we're not if we're not looking up and consuming information on our own, we end up turning to other people and trying to process those things with others without ever taking time to let ourselves go out, disconnect from all of the things that are coming into us, and let your brain sort of do what it's going to do.
yeah.
I don't know. I think
Yeah.
it's really important.
Like with the disconnecting thing, I think that's really valuable too, because I found it gets it when I go through like a very spending way too much time like on my phone and it's time for me to stop. There's such a strong urge to not have that silence, to like have something going through my brain. And it can be so valuable to just not be consuming information. And I think I saw somewhere that maybe it was on TikTok, ironically, but a teacher was talking about how her students, she teaches elementary, and so her students now really lack the ability to picture things in their mind because they don't have to imagine things, they don't have to picture things to keep themselves entertained because they can just watch YouTube videos thing on an iPad all the time. So
Wow.
that probably has interesting implications, but I think that's something that's that we could be losing is.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of implications in all of the technology and the way that we use them that we won't know the impact of them to like years down the line. But I think there's a level of like deterioration within our own selves of like how we process our own ideas and process information well, and the way that we process them well with others, because we're just always so virtually connected. Like we've never been more connected than ever before, like to all of these places around the world. Yet in the same breath, we've never felt more disconnected than before either. And I think there's a lot of this consumption and in this like virtual realm that's trying to make us feel more and more connected. And sometimes it can, but you take it to an extreme, it has this effect of starting to create more disconnection. And we don't know how to look people in the face anymore. We don't know how to make eye contact. We don't know how to have small talk. We don't know how to go on a train and not look at our phones and scroll through whatever. It's a problem. And of course there's always trade-offs with all of these things, but I do think that there's something to that that's actually making us worse at thinking critically, worse at processing information. And it's something I struggle with myself and try to fight, of like, okay, I can't, this cycle of trying to consume and get all the answers and make it all line up and be left with no questions is unsustainable. And learning how to embrace some sort of like mystery or uncertainty is definitely something I'm constantly sort of cycling through and trying to learn how to do better.
Yeah, like a comment on how small talk is becoming difficult, like coming onto campus. I remember one of the first group interactions I had, it felt, at least personally, it felt a lot like we were all afraid of the awkward silence. And so we were all trying really hard to fill it with interesting stories we had or interesting things that happened. And I felt pressure to think of things. And while people were talking, I wasn't even listening to them. I was just trying to think of something to say so that there wouldn't be any silence. And like reflecting on it, it kind of reminds me of social media and how on social media it's just constant, like interesting things from your friends. And there's never a dialogue. It's just like comments saying like, wow, that's so cool or so cute. And it's just so different from actual social interactions. But a lot of the times now, the most social we get is on these apps. And so
Right.
Yeah, I think that's interesting for sure.
And what I'm hearing you saying is you're starting to recognize that pattern that we have on these social media sites are being mirrored in reality. Where now, now it's like, oh, it's not about listening and trying to find out what people are doing. It's like, oh, how can I keep up the conversation and add something else and, kind of one up people. That's so interesting.
Yeah, almost like that.
Yeah. Well, and I also want to ask you, because you're in university now, and there's a lot of rigorous demands and studies and the way that you're having to learn things. How do you think that has impacted the way that you're consuming information and like coming to ideas?
I think some of my courses have been really helpful in like surprisingly, my favorite course last year was government, which I did not think it would be, but we read Tocqueville, Democracy in America. I don't know if you heard of it, but it's by a French author from a long time ago, and he talks about these patterns he sees in American democracy, and they're so prevalent now. And it was just really interesting to see the patterns. We also read Locke too, but I didn't expect to enjoy it. And I think, like having that kind of like reading before class and then discussing it in class was really helpful to process information. And I'm just thinking about this back right now, but I do think that was a nice way to things and get a different perspective that was different from just watching YouTube videos for
Right.
too long. Yeah, and also, in most of my classes, I would, also like an architecture class I took, I also really enjoyed readings and had discussions, and I think that was helpful too. Even though it was online, I think it was still helpful to engage with it with some people in my class.
Yeah. It's interesting. When I went through college, a lot of the classes that I took that I found the most interesting were the ones that had nothing to do with my major, and the ones that I kind of had to do because of some requirement. Like I took a Chinese literature class when I was in college, and it was so interesting, and it really opened my mind. And when I started college, I went into like a communications major. So I took a bunch of communication classes, like cultural communication classes and all of interpersonal communication and all of this stuff. And so to take some of those things I learned there and then put them into this like breaking down of this literature from this totally different culture at different times in different places. It was so fascinating. And that professor was definitely very interesting. He left a mark on me. And, it's funny, I did a year abroad when I was in Australia. And the way that they do their university, a lot of their classes just have to do with the major that they're taking, right? Like it's like, okay, you're a film major, you're just going to take film classes. You don't have to take all these prerequisites nonsense. And it's like on one level, that's like, well, that's kind of cool. You just really get specialized and you do your thing. But I really enjoyed being able to go to college and take these courses that I would never have taken before and expand and learn these things. And it definitely taught me how to think differently in a lot of ways. But on the other hand, I think there was this part of, the college experience. It got me interested in learning, but then it also got me in this place where I think it fed into some of the addiction of like consuming. Because, it's like so much of workload and you're always researching, you're always doing these things. And then when you're done, it's like, well, what am I going to do now? I'm going to go to YouTube and I'm going to just research and do all of these things. I think you match that with an existential crisis and you're in a real crisis.
I think for me, I feel like, I don't know, I think my, I guess binges of information happen more often when I am not feeling well. I think there's a correlation with that, and or when I like feel out of control. I definitely have seen that recently, but that's the most frequent driver those for me.
Yeah. And I would say I think definitely that sort of feeling of out of control has definitely been a piece of where my information consumption has gotten to its worst, where it's like you have no place to orient yourself, so you turn to information to try to find some foundation, and to a point it can be helpful, but oftentimes it becomes you're turning in the wrong place, and you get into this spiral where you really lose sight of anything that's true. Like you can't even really get a sense of what you actually believe is true, and that I think can be the most daunting.
I just saw like the symbolism in that, like how that apple is representative of knowledge, and so I guess isolation and like being out of control, feeling that makes us turn to
the
apple.
Fruit. Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah. Okay, so I want to go back to the Kierkegaard thing a little bit, because you said something about, Kierkegaard, and he was talking about how people were going into these deconstruction and then moving into sort of like a sensational, like worldly way to kind of escape that. Do you think that there's any of that happening in our time?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think it's we see a lot of constructions of materialism, people trying to buy things to make themselves feel better, and people go into politics to try to take control of the world. And I think that happens a lot, where we see people going out and pursuing these things that might lead them astray. But I mean, also another perspective, I was reading, this is so weird, but the Elements of Style, the writing book, it's like a writing guide. And so the author's note talks about how the writer was a proponent of always saying something confidently, even if you might be wrong. And I think that's a very interesting dichotomy, where one side, Kierkegaard, is saying he'd rather you be questioning and seeking instead of actively doing the wrong thing. And then on the other side is go for it, even if you're not sure. But I feel like there's a balance in there, but it's also difficult to find it. But
right. Well, because if you're on either end of the extreme, it's definitely going to leave marks. If you're like constantly questioning and you're so debilitated by the questions that you can't move, like that's not a place to be. But to act so confidently and arrogantly about things that maybe you shouldn't be so confident about is also something that, like, it can be really dangerous. And I think when you're talking about religious fervor and then sort of deconstruction, you end up on some of these two lines. And sometimes they sort of intermix a little bit, where you get these confident deconstructors where it's like, I don't know anything and this is all wrong. You're just like, whoa, you're very certain about like all of this stuff being hogwash. Yet you got this other side where it's like, we have the corner on truth. We know what it is. And like, you shouldn't question anything. And it's like, well, that's not healthy either. Yeah. And I think there's just not a lot of spaces where, like, I think our culture values the confidence. They value speaking confidently. And that's the thing that gets the clicks. That's the thing that gets the likes. And to be uncertain about something, especially on certain moral or political issues, becomes a problem. And I think that's where you're seeing some of this insistence on cancel culture of like, how dare they even try to suggest that's a gray area. And so like, we just have to shut that down. And I don't actually think that's helpful. And like, even when somebody has a wrong belief or a wrong perspective, that's actually not something good for society or for themselves. It's really hard to even work through that, because, it's to even have the questions or have the belief in itself becomes a problem.
I think like the question I deal with that is just finding the balance, like how far deconstructed is enough, and then from there you start building up. And that's something that I feel like I lean more towards the deconstruction side. And so I don't know, I think it's difficult to decide when you can start moving up again and start building up.
Well, and you're still in a place where it's like, that's probably exactly where you should be. You're still very young. You're still new to all of this stuff. It's okay to keep poking, deconstructing, moving the pieces away. I think there's a point where it can be very destructive. And if you don't make the choice to say, okay, I need to stop just pulling all the parts away, you're gonna hit a crash. It's just inevitable. And like learning how to take that gracefully, or trying to stop it from happening, and being willing to sort of humble yourself and work to take steps to either pause the deconstruction or watch somebody else reconstructing to get a little bit of confidence to start reconstructing yourself is really important. But I think the biggest thing, despite how long you're deconstructing, just don't let it stay that way. If you deconstruct a piece of machinery to fix the problem that's within it, but never put it back together and just leave it strewn about, it's no use to anybody. It's not until we reconstruct it and test it again and see if the kinks are out of the machine can we ever really understand it, like if what we're believing, what we're standing for is working. And so it's like, yeah, I think there's a place for deconstruction, and it's okay to be in that. I think it's good step. Like, it's a good sign that you're even thinking about that, of like, how long do I deconstruct and where does the reconstruction stop? I think a lot of people don't think that far ahead. They're just like, you got to pull the thread and you're left with no sweater. And now what do I do?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's such a process. And I think that is something that's so individualized. There's so many there's so many things and factors that go into that, and there are so many pitfalls you can fall into. Like, even the most well-intended deconstructor can end up falling into some really toxic places, just because they fall into the sand pit. And it's like all around us. There's so many ways to like slip.
Yeah, I really liked the analogy of the machine. I think that was a good analogy. And I also thought it was interesting how you mentioned like the humbleness of deconstructing and then looking to see, oh, like maybe I shouldn't be so confident about deconstruction. Because I think I remember there was this one part in Kierkegaard's writings where he mentioned how irony by claiming that there's no absolutes is the absolute. So I think that's like a different perspective on that, and how maybe you can't always be so confident about poking holes in things and finding like deconstructing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I think a lot of that too just comes from my Christian background. Like, I think a lot of the way that I looked at deconstruction and the way that I reconstructed, and um, it has a lot to do with my faith, and I can't really separate those things completely. Although when I try to talk about deconstruction and those things, I try not to link them too much, because I think there's a space in which where all of this is outside of a specific religion. And I came back to Christianity, and I wouldn't say I ever lost it, really. I never became an atheist, or like an agnostic. Like, there was always a part of me that's like, I know that I believe in Christianity and I believe in God. I just kind of got to figure out why and see if that belief is worth holding personally. And like, I it took me probably 6 to 8 months to get to a confident place to say, well, okay, I think I believe that there's a God. And I feel more confident in that answer than the answers that atheism is giving me. Okay. And then, another probably 5-6 months of exploring other religions, and mostly just really digging into Christianity and trying to, I took it as a way of like, okay, I'm going to try to find holes in this and sort of disprove it, right? Like, I don't want this burden of proof is on you to show me that it's wrong. It's like, no, the burden on proof is on myself, because I want to know the answer. So I'm just going to search, and I'm my bias is to be inclined that Christianity is true, because it's what I grew up in, and it's when I adopted it for myself in a real way, it's what gave me hope and meaning and like passion. So there's always going to be this thing that's going to want to look for it to be true, but I'm going to really try to be critical and find holes, and I'm going to look at all the sources, but like, I'm going to try to find a way to like ask all of the questions. And I eventually got to a place where I started to feel confident, in Jesus and Christianity. And I don't think that will change, but I'm always open enough to say, like, if I can be shown that it's not true, like, I want to believe what's true.
Mhm.
And that's where this sort of like personal truth, ultimate truth dilemma comes, where it's like, this is my personal truth that I think Christianity is true. But I also, within my personal truth, am making a claim that I think that is ultimately true. And yeah, I think I'm going to spend my life testing those assumptions and trying to understand deeper, what is Christianity really meant historically? What does it mean in the grand scheme of culture? And how does it mean for me to act those things out? And like, there's been a lot of ups and downs with that, and testing the waters of my assumptions of what I had growing up. And I've made mistakes, and learned good things from them. I've done things that people may call mistakes, that I actually think were exactly what I needed to go through. And I feel lucky in that way, where I do think there's a big part of, my faith that helps me in that journey. And I I always wish that for other people, that they could have that hope within those things, but it's not something I think you can just whip yourself into and force yourself to believe. I think it's something that happens outside of you. And so I'm very sympathetic and understanding of people who really can't believe those things or claim those things, because like I understand it, and I don't think it's something to be taken lightly. But yeah, I think all that to say, I think there's a lot of that, sort of patience that comes from that background in my faith.
Yeah, like something you mentioned is like having that personal truth, but also wanting to be be available, I guess, for an ultimate truth if you're shown it. And I think like in my own search, I don't know when to like stop holding on to options, I guess. It's like I almost want to have all the options and not make a choice. And I think it's just a matter of I guess that it takes time and patience to figure it out. But yeah.
Well, and you're in that again, you're in that age where that's so exciting. Like, oh, there's so many options, there's so many things I can do, and you want to have your little hands in all of it. And it's like I definitely understand that perspective. And I think there are times I still fight for that. But after a certain age, I think I hit 26, 27, and I was like, I'm so tired of like not having like a direction and a for sure answer. And at that time, I think I was more settled in religion, but definitely not fully. And it was just sort of like, I know that it's not the time to be certain and settled, but like it gets really hard. And you do have to sort of fight that as you get older, that option of just wanting the doors to be closed. Because a time does come where you're like, I don't want all of the options. I just want the right one. And you can get debilitated in that, like, oh, what if I take the wrong path? What if I take the wrong journey? And like, I do think that there are wrong paths to take, but I also think that there are so many paths that they eventually do lead to similar places. Um, it just depends on how you're going. And so that you just got to be really discerning, like for yourself, and say, okay, do I really want to seek truth? Like that's the thing that you have to like get in your head first. Do I personally really want to know what's true, or am I just in the game of like making myself feel okay with the things that I believe now? And then once you get there, that's like the first step. And it's like not an easy step to take, but then you kind of you can get to the place where it's like, if I'm seeking genuinely, and this is what I believe, and I'm sure some Christians will say that this is misguided, but like if you're starting there, like, and if God really knows your heart, like he knows what actions you're taking. And so you just got to be discerning enough to say, I'm going to take these steps and like the right action, and I'm going to be willing enough to like discern the good, discern the bad, and be cautious in those things. And um you learn so much from it. I mean, I just learned so much from trying out all of these. I mean, I didn't try out a ton, but I talked with people who had other religions, like in a genuine way, and tried to really understand, okay, where you're coming from, how do you get to this idea, and just trying to take it in, learning their conception of it. And I learned a lot of good things. I learned a lot of reasons why I didn't find those things compelling. And, there were times where it's like, oh, I don't know, it doesn't feel quite right. And I don't know why, but like, I'm just going to listen to that instinct and acknowledge it and just keep moving forward. Like it's just not an easy answer either way though, because there's so many people and so many different paths. And it's like, how do you discern? Should I move forward? Should I turn around? Should I just stop and get my bearings? There's not one answer for everybody. And that's where this sort of like personal, like this personal journey to like get to something ultimately true really resonates with me, because it's like, I can't give you a cookie cutter answer of like, here are the steps and you'll definitely get to this answer. It's far more complicated than that. And I think it ultimately just starts with like, what is my mindset? Like, am I really looking at this genuinely and trying to see good? Or is there something underneath that's not quite right? And I think even that's sometimes hard to discern.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are definitely so many religions, and that's something that like I realized while I was going through all that. And even in Christianity, there's so many debate about what you should do and all that. And so I don't know, it just seems like there's so many options and so many paths, and it's definitely pretty overwhelming sometimes.
Oh yeah. I mean, I still find myself overwhelmed by it. I mean, earlier today I had a conversation with my family about, because I'm looking into orthodoxy, and they're not mad about that. In fact, they're like, oh, most of them are fine. But getting this conversation of like Calvinism and Arminianism and orthodoxy and how all those things sort of meld together, and it's like there's I mean, and I think for me, I've just sort of been on this journey where I've started questioning the things that I believed. And I think it'd be very hard for me to go back to Protestantism, which is something that I basically grew up with. And I don't think my parents care about that, but there's still certain things where it's like, yeah, I hear what you're saying. And that used to make sense to me. But also now I see it so differently. And like, learning how to like process that. And um, I think I have to really learn how to not get too upset when I can't be understood.
Mm,
I think sometimes when you're in the middle and you're like seeing things, and whether you're seeing a pattern in something or you're seeing something that doesn't feel quite right, but you don't have the right words, you try to explain that. And especially with the piece of people closest to you, it can be hard to really articulate all of that.
yeah.
And I think I get really frustrated in where I just really want to be a good communicator. I want to be able to like take the things that are jumbled in my head and the way that I see it and make sense to the people around me. And
Mhm,
sometimes I just got to learn I don't need to do that. Like, it's okay to just work on it myself and take time to do those things. But
mhm.
I definitely feel you with this sort of confusion of all of these denominations and all of this, like, all the chaos within um I want to say Protestantism, but it lies in all the denominations of religion and Christianity. And it's like, how do you weed through the noise? And how do you get yourself in the right spirit to really hear the criticisms of what you believe, in the hopes that you can understand that thing better. I'm still figuring that out.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely think it is, because both my parents are atheists, and they've grown up with it. And so my mom especially, I love talking to her, but she's very against, because she grew up in China, and so she's against the collectivism and the kind of the group mentality.
Mm,
And so because of that, she doesn't like religion's aspect of community. And
sure.
so when I've tried to talk to her about like the things I'm trying to process, it always feels like there's a disconnect there, because um, she's like she has some um, antagonism, I think, towards religion as a whole, and so it's just hard to kind of frame it in the way that I understand it. And yeah.
Yeah, well, and it's got to be hard for her too, because she's known you as this other person for so long, and the way that you thought, and now you're growing into this new thing, and you're adjusting, and you're being open to this thing that you never were before, and that they never really were. And so now it's like, it's hard when you're so close to someone to really look at their actions in a way that's not clouded by fear, or like
Mhm.
sort of just misunderstanding of trying to hold them in this place that they used to be, and not taking the time to see where they're growing and how they're seeing different things. And it just takes time. It's a process. And I think it's so hard for us where the people we care about the most, our families, our closest friends, when we don't have their full support or approval, it can be really difficult. It can be hard to process through things, even if you feel like you're moving in the right direction. Um, so it's definitely just a lot of this is dynamics of individuals and how we're communicating with each other outside of just the strict information, the ideas. And I think we often get to the place when we're talking about ideas and like big questions where we want to just talk about the information, and like if it's so clear, if there's a right answer and a wrong answer, like we just need to get this all sorted out and then it'll all make sense. But no, like we're such relational beings that if we can't learn how to be better communicators, better understanders, better listeners, we're never going to be able to really learn how to work through all of these complicated equations.
Yeah, I think communication is really important, and it's just there's always a barrier between two people. Like as I change, I'm not constantly updating my mom on my religious thoughts or anything. It's more like I update her when I feel like I have something to talk about, but she doesn't get to see the evolution that I've gone through. And so that difference is pretty jarring, and so it makes it it makes it even more difficult for her to kind of understand. And so yeah, it's just learning how to listen, learning how to communicate. Those are definitely important.
I think you're right on when it's like you get this all of a sudden, like for somebody, it seems like this like immediate shift, but every single day of our lives, we're constantly changing and adjusting, even the smallest ways that we can't totally identify. And sometimes we can identify big changes, but it's like all of these little things that eventually led us to this different path. And then all of a sudden you're ready to let people in your life and say, oh, hey, I'm starting to rethink these things, or, I'm just playing with these ideas. And it's like, you need, and like, it's all, I think a lot of times it's just coming from like goodness. Like I had my sister tonight ask me, well, are you still a Christian? I'm like, yes, I'm still a Christian. But like, there's just this different way that I talk about it. And I don't know if I try to be more cautious or more coy about the way that I speak about things, but there are certain ways that it's like I know what you're going to think when I say this from this Protestant frame, and like I'm not even like mad that you're asking me these questions. I think they're good questions, but it can definitely sort of get complicated, and there's this little dance where we're all playing to try to make sense of that. But I think that is something to keep in mind, where it's like, well, you've been on this journey for a long time and you've slowly seen the things mutate and, find a different curve. But to them, it's like Rome was built in a day. It's like, wait, how did this come from? And so, I think that's a good thing to remember when we're really addressing people we care about who haven't really walked through step by step on the journey, that like for them, there's a piece of it that does just feel like they're missing the steps in between, and you're never going to be able to fully show that. Like, but how do we live that out and make that make sense going forward? I don't know.
Yeah, I think kind of an interesting relation, I guess, but I was just working on an essay I'm taking a Bible and its interpreters class.
Oh, cool.
But the essay was on translation. And so I guess the argument I make is that, I don't know what kind of argument this is, but it's like, instead of looking to the Bible for an ultimate translation, a different perspective could be to seek to understand its role in history and how it's developed, how it's changed, and how people have seen it. And I think that could kind of apply to relations and communication as well. Instead of finding like an ultimate definition of a person and who they are right now, it's more about how they've changed in their story. And I guess that could be a better way of looking at interactions, I think.
Yeah, Totally. And like, this channel, like, I don't know what I'm doing with it, but there's so many things in my head where it's like, okay, I want to talk about these things, but like, I feel like I have to set up a framework before I can really get into these ideas and break those things. But there's definitely some videos coming up that I want to talk about, that's talking about, well, how do we interpret text, especially religious texts? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and often just like naive thinking that goes in from all sides of the spectrum of like how like what's going on here and how to look at those things. And just also the way that we use words. One of the first things they teach you when you go to communications major is like, words don't have meaning, we give words meaning. And that's not to say that words don't mean things, like that they don't have like objective meanings in the world, but a lot of times we individually bring this baggage and like perception of what those words mean. And that really complicates all of the equations. And it's not just between us, it's also, between cultures. And as time goes on, things evolve and things change. And we want it to be black and white. We want it to be, this is what it means, and this is how it should be used and interpreted. And it's like, okay, maybe, but also you have to understand that like there's a bit of language that's fluid, and the way that we communicate that's fluid, that's not always gonna be the same. And to be so rigid in your structure, like it's not going to help you in like communications, especially when you're talking about different things. And yeah, I mean, oh gosh, that you could go on for so long about that, but I totally think you're right. And that, yes, maybe there are certain ways um, that we already look at it that are really great in how we understand religious texts or the way we communicate with people, but maybe there's something else going on here. And like, we got to get underneath the deeper level of the story to understand what does it really mean? Like, what is it really saying? And how should we interact with it, and how should we let that thing dictate our lives? Those are really important questions. And I do think sometimes we take those, religious people especially take those very lightly without thinking about it.
Yeah, like in our class, we've looked at, for instance, the Greek version of Esther versus the Hebrew version, and how the Greek version, I think the Hebrew version doesn't have any mention of God, but the Greek version is full of interaction with God. And I think that was so interesting. The stories are so different from each other, and they kind of, I feel like they have completely different themes and lessons. And so, I don't know, that was like learning about that, and also learning about a lot of the different translation issues definitely makes me question like the Bible in general. And so I think, yeah, that's also a difficult thing to work through as well.
Oh yeah, but it's so fascinating. I'm obsessed with like just Bible and language and the way that it's interacted. And there's something about it that has just transcended cultures and continues to be relevant. And I do think that there's a lot of questions, especially in the modern conception of what is the Bible and how do we use it, that does create these sort of questions, especially when you start to unpack some of these translation things and get into some of the nitty-gritty of the complications of that. But I don't think it means that there's not an answer. I just think it just gets to the point where like, oh well, maybe there's more to learn. Maybe there's something like a different way, and maybe I'm approaching this in my mindset the wrong way. And yeah, it's kind of exciting. Like there's more to learn. There's so much to see. And yeah, there's a lot to there's a lot to unpack, especially when you're trying to figure out what something means that was written 2,000 years ago in a completely different language and a completely different culture that you don't understand. And there's like a patience that involves with that, but you can easily get overwhelmed and, let it worry you, or you can switch the mindset of like, okay, well, something's here, something's going on. Let's unpack it. Let's figure out what makes the most sense to me. And like, let's not placate that to to fit like somebody else's version just because it's easier. That's often not the right path. But again, there's a whole balance there too. There's so much to unpack here.
Yeah, something Kierkegaard mentions, I think he was talking about science, but he was talking about the importance of relating these things, these objective things, to the personal, and how that's a really important part of new information and the way we see things.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that applies to the Bible as well. It's not just what's on the page, it's how it relates is almost just as important or more.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you so much. I love this conversation. I'm so excited to share it. So thank you for having it with me.
I was really excited to do it, so I'm glad it happened.
Yeah. Thanks so much for watching. And as always, I will close with the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.